Okay, we're going to be starting chapter 13. You can see it's titled Trigonometry, and we will be using several different things that you learned back in geometry when you studied trigonometry. Okay. So right now, we'll start and see what you do remember after we go over the learning goals. So here we go. Do you remember how to find the trigonometric functions of acute angles? And can you solve a right triangle by using those trigonometric functions? So let's go right ahead and see what that looks like. We're going to deal with right triangle trig first. So you should remember sine, cosine, tangent. So take a good look. If we say recognize the different parts, you should be able to tell me what is the different part of this triangle. And right now we've got it marked as the hypotenuse is always across from the right angle. You should have learned that. The opposite side is across from the acute angle in question. So right now, based on this triangle, we know that the angle in question is angle A. It's the only angle that's marked in degrees. So if angle A is in question, across from that acute angle has to be the opposite side. So it's opposite edge from that angle. That leaves just one side, and it's the adjacent. A lot of people like to think next to and touching. So next to that angle, but not the hypotenuse, is the adjacent side, and it's touching or comes out of that angle A. All right, with that, you should be able to take any combination of a triangle and rewrite it and name its sides. So if we said, here's a triangle, what would you label it? Now we have angle A in a different perspective. The right angle is in a different position, and you should still be able to go around and label based on your definitions. So quickly, you should be able to do something like the hypotenuse, longest side. The side opposite would be here. That leaves that side to be the adjacent. Questions? Okay, next slide. Another situation, different angle, still combinations. So a lot of people like to identify the hypotenuse first, so if we do that, then we can go to the opposite or the adjacent, your choice. But based on how the perspective changed, so should those edges. They are not always left, right, up, down. No, not in a right triangle. Okay, you've also learned sine, cosine, tangent. But now we're going to add to that cosecant, secant, and cotangent. There are actually 6 trig functions you should be aware of, and not just 2. Now, most of you have learned the 3 trig functions, and you learned them quite well. And in our work, most of you would tell me that you also learn Sohcahtoa. It is a made-up word. Some people will tell you it's an Indian word for sure, not really, but Sohcahtoa stands for the 3 you spent quite a bit of time on in geometry class. Sine is opposite over hypotenuse. Cosine, that's the C, is the adjacent over the hypotenuse. And then the tangent is the opposite over the adjacent. So you can see each letter in that word, Sohcahtoa, helps you remember the combinations. You definitely want those combinations down, memorized, and done well. Now, take a good look. You would think that the words would sort of go together, but they do, sort of. There's a pattern. Sine, cosine, tangent, but now we've got cosecant, secant, and cotangent. And start looking. We had sine was opposite over hypotenuse. We now have the secant is the hypotenuse over the opposite. The cosine was adjacent over hypotenuse. The secant is hypotenuse over adjacent. And the tangent was opposite over adjacent, so the cotangent has to be adjacent over opposite. Probably a good piece of history or mathematical history would be to look up and how come they didn't do it sine and then cosine as its inverse, tangent and cotangent they did, secant and cosecant they didn't, but sine, cosine, and tangent are your first three, and then the other ones remaining, cosecant, secant, cotangent, are the reciprocals of your first three you learned. So sine is the reciprocal of cosecant, cosine is the reciprocal of secant, and tangent is the reciprocal of cotangent. Okay. What else were we expecting you to learn in geometry? You should have worked on exact values. So with your devices, you should be able to, or just looking at the solution if you don't have a device and you're at home watching this, the sine of 30. You should know that in a 30, 60, 90, which is what we have here, triangle, you have some edges. And by looking at this, you should be able to tell me what the sine of the 30 degrees is. And again, when we say sine of 30 degrees, that means your eyes are falling here at angle A. Okay? You know that sine is opposite over hypotenuse, so you should be finding the opposite side and the hypotenuse and stating what that would be as a fraction in lowest terms. So opposite over hypotenuse, yes, should be choice A. Good job. What is the tangent of 60 degrees? Now again, the tangent you should know because we have everything marked. Your eyeballs are focusing here because that's where your 60-degree angle is. But again, tangent, opposite over adjacent. So you start looking right away. Find the 60 degree, the opposite versus the adjacent. So look at what that would be as a fraction. And you can see that the correct answer should be choice C. So far, so good. Hopefully you have some of those memorized. Cosine of 30, so again, because the whole triangle is marked, you need to focus here, the 30-degree angle, and then cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. So you're looking for the one that's next to, but not the hypotenuse, adjacent over hypotenuse, and there's the hypotenuse. So square root of 3 over 2 will give you choice B. So look carefully in your triangle. Based on the labels and markings, you should definitely know those values. Now, be very careful because we're also expecting you to know a few things from geometry, and they're called the exact values. You should be able to say the sine of 30, the sine of 60, and, whoops, meant to squeeze 45 in there, and the sine of 45, so back it up, the sine of 30, sine of 45, and the sine of 60. You know that those were angles that came from the special triangles that we studied. So you should have some of these memorized based on your right triangles, your 30, 60, 90s that you worked on. So when we say exact values, we want you to say, well, wait a minute, sine of 30? What is it? So I want you to write this down, and we'll talk about it when we come to class. What is the sine of 30? What is the sine of 45? What is the sine of 60? And no, we're not talking decimals. Exact values. That's the key here. And then also, what do you remember from geometry about the tangent of theta? There should be something memorized there. Now, obviously, I'm doing 30, 60, and 45s. 30, 60, 90 is the triangle, and 45, 45, 90 is the triangle. But by having these memorized, hopefully you came with that information. We'll talk more in class and see what you have, see what you don't have. But sort of write those down and see what you remember, and we'll talk about what we're expecting you to have. Okay, so first section, Intro to Trig, should be pretty basic. Don't think you'll have too many problems. But bring any questions, and especially about these exact values if you don't remember them. Some questions you might have in that regard, bring them to class.